The political, the nation, and the individual are ideas with historical roots. Plato presented his meditations on these ideas in the Republic many centuries ago. Other political theorists who have followed Plato have expanded, challenged, and presented new dimensions to these concepts. However, the cultural magnitude, geographical vastness, and history of India situate thinkers like Gandhi and Ambedkar, who wrote extensively on these ideas, in an indispensable position. Therefore, any attempt to discuss the modernity of India or the modern Indian, it is imperative to evoke their thoughts. To help us think further about these ideas, we have with us Professor Ananya Vajpeyi. Welcome to the second season of Quintessential Conversations. This is our third episode, and today we are going to be talking about the modern imaginings of a modern nation state, India. Today we have with us the guest, Dr. Ananya Vajpeyi. She is an associate professor at a Center for the Study of Developing Societies (CSDS) in New Delhi. So our first question would be that you grew up in India and you worked in the United States. How did your childhood develop your idea of India, Indian culture, and identity? What kind of changes did those ideas actually undergo once you went to the US and started working there?
Well, thank you for having me to your very wonderful series. Um, I did grow up in India, although the first 5 years of my life was spent overseas. My parents were on assignment. They were working and studying first in Mexico City, and then in the US. But when I when it came time for me to go to school, we came back to India, and then I went through school and college and university, my MA at least, in Delhi, and then I went away abroad again to study. I went to England first, then I went to the US. Then I came back to India, then I went back again to the US, then I came back to India again. So I've been I would say I've spent, more than a third, maybe almost half my life overseas. Um, but it's been, I don't feel, out of place either here or there. Possibly because we started traveling when literally the day I was born, and continued to travel even when I was growing up, all over India, Europe, in the UK, in the US, and then subsequently, as an adult on my own, I've been in many different parts of the world. Um, I think I've been pretty grounded and comfortable as an Indian. I've never felt the need to sort of go away and reinvent myself as an immigrant. I always see myself as a traveler, but not necessarily ever as an immigrant or an emigrant out of here, or an immigrant to settle down elsewhere. Had strong ties with my family, with my teachers, with Delhi where I grew up, but also I spent a lot of time in South India, and I spent a fair amount of time in Calcutta and West Bengal, and at this point I have sort of reasons, partly to do with research, partly to do with friendships and ties, partly to do with my interests, not just in scholarly questions, but also in the arts and in cultural and political affairs. I feel at home in different parts of India as well. It's not just that I have to be in Delhi or something like this. I think one of the things that helped me to always feel that I was able to relate to a place, and some places more easily than others, was that I've always grown up with a lot of languages. So I told you, when I was a kid, we lived in Mexico. So I learned how to speak Spanish, Hindi, and English together. Subsequently, I lost my Spanish because I never quite had a chance to learn it as a kid. But because of that beginning, I then studied, French and Italian and German. And my parents, my mother was, her family is from pre-partition Punjab, and they're Punjabi-speaking Sikhs. My father's from UP, so I grew up listening to equal amounts of Hindi, Punjabi, and Urdu. And then I studied these European languages as a consequence of this early exposure to Spanish. And then, of course, I became a linguist, and I started, studying languages because of being interested in linguistics, but also in philology and in textual and literary studies of various kinds and literature. So when I was doing my doctoral work at the University of Chicago, I actually spent half the time of my PhD, or more than half possibly, in India, reading texts and learning languages and doing archival work and field work, mostly in Karnataka and Maharashtra at that time. But obviously, because I was in the region, I also traveled to Andhra and Tamil Nadu and Kerala and so on. And now I go back to all these places sort of routinely and regularly. So I studied some Sanskrit, I studied some Marathi. I even tried to study some Kannada, which was the least successful, I would say, the hardest of all my. Although I have some comprehension of the language. So, and then I've spent time in a lot of time in Turkey recently in the last few years, in Istanbul. I've spent time in the Netherlands, in France, in Italy, in Germany, in the UK, and everywhere I go, it helps me that I have some sense of the language. Either I can speak it, or I can read and write it, or I have good comprehension of it. I've even sort of acquired some Turkish, which is relatively difficult because it's unrelated to other languages that I know. But this, this has always been for me a key thing. Some amount of exposure, but also some amount of linguistic access. So when I go to Bengal, I'm very comfortable because I can almost entirely follow the Bengali. Even if I can't speak it, I know what the environment becomes alive in a particular way that really makes you feel like you're, a fish in water, even if you're not a native speaker, so to speak. I feel similarly in Maharashtra, and I'm quite comfortable even in Karnataka now. Tamil and Malayalam are things which I've only in recent years developed more of an interest in, partly because of last 7, 8, 10 years I've been interested in Carnatic music and in Kudiyattam as a performance, although it's in Sanskrit, but it's in Kerala, and so now I have these Malayali practitioners of Kudiyattam, and so I go there often and things like that. And because of my interest in Carnatic music, I've sort of really, it's been like a steep learning curve for me. But I've spent now a lot of time in Chennai, and earlier when I was a student, I spent a lot of time in Mysore, in Bangalore, in other parts of southern and southwestern Karnataka. And now I go all the time also to Kerala, especially around Kochi, partly for the art and partly for the music and dance and theatre and so on. So it's, to my mind, I mean, the ways in which, I mean, I'm more conscious than most people of how constructed an identity is, especially a national identity. You know, what does it mean to be Indian? But to me, in a concrete sense, I think historical, cultural, linguistic immersion and interaction and comprehension, and trying to deepen that understanding through either interpersonal or institutional or you know, even sometimes just you know, traveling experiences as a tourist, you know, even in your own country. It really it really it concretizes a sense of what it means to be Indian. You know, I mean, in the last few years, I've also sort of had a consistent, you know, connection in Gujarat and also in Kashmir. And so, you know, all these things, a lot of friends who are Assamese. So these things kind of help me to both complicate and diversify, but also consolidate what to me it means to be Indian. Now, as far as being overseas, I mean, I have studied in the States. I've lived there, I've worked there, I've taught there, you know, published my book there, and some of my dearest friends are there. And I go regularly, even if I don't spend, you know, I'm not living there anymore, but I go all the time to the States, and also to Europe, and little less to England. I mean, I don't like what's happening in the UK, but I do, you know, maintain my ties overseas, let's say, and and you know, it's, I've always been bilingual, if you know what I mean. I mean, I've always been bicultural, at least, and to me, that doesn't upset my sense of self. It just makes it richer or more complicated. And sometimes I find myself in the situation where I have to translate for others who might be with me. You know, so if my friends come to visit me from the States, I often travel sometimes with my friends. You know, I told you I had this friend come from New York recently, and we traveled together in Bengal. And it helps me a lot, actually, to get to know a place if I feel that I'm responsible for showing a friend around, you know, and introducing a friend to my friends, and in a way inviting them into my relationship with that place. A few years ago, we had a friend from Lahore, from Pakistan, who wanted to visit Srinagar, and she's actually a daughter of Faiz Ahmed Faiz, and she wanted to see the college in Srinagar where her parents had been married. And then after that, she wanted to spend time in Srinagar, and she and I went together up to Gulmarg, you know, and it was such an emotional journey for her. You know, she's an elderly woman. Her father's long been dead, and the relationship between Pakistan and India is so fraught, and it was difficult for her to make this journey. And then on top of that, we were going into Kashmir. She comes to Delhi more regularly, but we were going into Kashmir, which is hard even for any of us to go to, you know, leave aside for her. And then it referred back to a time when things were not the way they are today, you know. And it was intensely emotional, very difficult, quite sad in many ways. You know, and we were all kind of shaken up and shattered by this trip, but it was also very, very gratifying to be able to witness her kind of sense of a return, to some long lost, point of origin, in a sense, for her. And I've had similar experiences with other friends in different parts of India. And similarly, when I've traveled in Turkey, for instance, or recently in the Czech Republic, or in Italy a lot actually, or in France, I've always gone with friends who are locals or who have a home there or who grew up there but don't live there necessarily anymore themselves, and they've also become immigrants or diaspora or something. And these kinds of journeys can be very meaningful for all, because it, like I said, it gives you a deeper understanding of who you are and who you aren't and who you could be. But also it gives you an insight into the identity, the sense of place, belonging, or the sense of displacement of others who you care about. And that's, I don't know, I generally find that to be the way that I like to live my life, rather than feeling comfortable and settled. One of my dreams, of course, is to go back to Mexico, because I haven't been since I was a very small child, and I have these, I don't even know if they are memories or they are just things that are made up from what my parents have told me or for photographs. There was a film a couple of years ago called Roma, which was about a neighborhood in Mexico City, and it just, it just kind of opened some floodgate in my head, because it is set in Mexico City in the 1970s, and that's when I was there as a baby, and I've just felt that I could relate to the landscape or the cityscape in such a profound way, which was almost pre-conscious, and it just triggered a lot of very deep memories, I think, of my parents too when they were young. So yeah, I'm not sure I've answered your question about identity, but I feel that identity is something which is constantly, it's you're building it and rebuilding it and losing it and forgetting it and reconstituting it. But the main thing is to be quite porous to your environment, and that transforms you. If you have that openness, that porosity, then through a process of osmosis, I mean, I think I've been very deeply changed by the time I've spent in South India, the time I've spent in Istanbul or in other parts of Turkey. These have been profoundly sort of redefining moments for me in terms of understanding myself, understanding my place in the world, and also the transience of the world itself, I'm now I have no particular reason to keep going back to Istanbul anymore. At one point I did, but now I just go there voluntarily, because some mornings I wake up and it feels to me like I should be back in my old neighborhood and I should be able to go get a chai, in my usual sort of dhaba there, and I need to see and speak to my friends there, and I need to take a walk by the Bosphorus today, right now, because of something that triggers it, and then I try to go as much as I can, but yeah, it's a work in progress. I think these days being Indian can often feel traumatizing, because I find the kind of violence and injustice that is escalating in India over the last decade, especially, it 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 not only troubles me because it affects our country. I mean, but it also makes me question whether whether the fundamentals are strong enough to hold out, even if this is just a phase. Are we going to survive it in any I mean, are we going to come out of it still recognizable as the India that one knows and loves? I also feel a lot of shame and a lot of guilt because I feel that there are so many sections of the population who are so badly let down, so badly aggressed against, and so badly treated. Who have, India has failed most Indians, and I feel that as a kind of, not just a sense of disappointment. I feel that as as a cause for shame at this terrible political and moral failure that has resulted in this kind of a political environment. And I I mean, there are days when I wish I could run away somewhere, but you can't run away from India. Wherever you go, it follows you, and you come back to it. Um, and I think, gosh, I wish I could just get a job somewhere and never have to come back. But I've tried that. I mean, there's no such thing. There's nowhere to go, really. Um, I was just talking to a friend. He's a very eminent scholar. Um, in he teaches in the US in a major law school, and he's half Indian, but he's grown up completely. He's totally American. I mean, he's grown up there and stuff. But he comes here. He has a sort of spiritual home in uh, in South India, and he comes regularly to this particular place where he has a kind of faith in a spiritual leader. And he said he's going through a hard time, and he's feeling terrible with the way things are deteriorating in US academia with all these new softwares, Chat GPT and things like that. And he said, the whole thing, it's just falling apart because people are just cheating. And if you can't trust the basics of the system, then how are you going to sustain the university? And on top of that, the kinds of managerial and administrative burdens, and scholars don't get to read, write, teach, and do research anymore. They're just always like doing nonsensical office work. And our usual discussion we all have about, especially in the humanities and social sciences. And he was really lamenting that, and he was saying, I feel a lot of burnout. But he said, there's always India, and there's always the pull of India, and there's always, sometimes I wish, he said, I could just, I know, what is happening there these days, and I know you all are struggling, but I still feel that if everything else fails, there'll always be India. And I thought to myself, wow, because here we are. And a lot of my friends are like, if all else fails, we'll leave the country, And here's my American friend saying, even if the world comes to an end, there's always India. He said, the pull of India is very strong, he said. And when I'm really just done with, when I'm burnt out and I can't cope anymore, I remind myself.
In recent history, one idea that has sort of renewed our understanding of the Indian self has been modernity. But like modernity in itself is such a vague concept. How do we even begin to understand its influence on Indian society and identity?
Well, it's not a vague concept. I mean, it's not a vague concept, but I think what you mean by that is that it could
Broad.
mean different things to
Yeah.
different people. What does it mean to be a modern person? Of course, you've already talked to Dipesh Da, and he's the king of modernity. But exactly, I mean, he's the go-to guy on modernity. But I mean, I think that, again, this is something that I've also visited and revisited a lot. Partly because at some point in my scholarly training, I started to study Sanskrit. And when I started to study Sanskrit, that immediately kind of, created a kind of temporal, collapse of horizons in my own understanding of past and present, and history and modernity, and tradition and modernity. It became like the central question for me, and it continues to be. What is the presence of the past? What is the pastness of the past? Are things that we think of as being traditional really that traditional, or are they profoundly modern in some sense? If something is given to you as being unchanging, or as having come down from time immemorial, chances are it's probably exactly the opposite of that. And it was just cooked up quite recently. And I think you learn to recognize markers of continuity and signs of disruption in different phenomena. Let me try and explain that. I'm sorry, now I'm sounding vague, I guess. Actually, I'm currently working on a book about Sanskrit, about the modern life of Sanskrit, and the modern life of an ancient language. Now, you have to ask these basic questions about Sanskrit. I mean, is it a classical language? Is it a dead language? Is it a contemporary language? Is it an Indian language? Is it a language at all in any sense that we understand? Because it doesn't have any associated speech community in a sociological sense. Nobody anywhere is running around and doing their primary talking or their work of everyday life, their communication of everyday life in Sanskrit. Nobody's claiming it as a sign of their identity or their their regional vernacular culture, their ethnicity, their religion, their caste. Nobody's saying, it is because of Sanskrit that I am who I am, whereas people are saying that about all other languages, in India at least. So in what sense is it modern or non-modern, and if it's non-modern, if it's ancient, then why didn't it get left behind in the past? Why is it alive in our midst, and in what sense is it alive, and in what sense is it being understood or used or interpreted or made to do things in the world, right? And this kind of question, which I am focusing on Sanskrit for my own book, I mean, this kind of question arises about many things, especially, I think, in a country like India. Many aspects of religious life, are they traditional or are they modern? Many aspects of gendered identities, and this becomes very, very important for families and for women. Because women are often seen as the sort of keepers and repositories of cultural identity. And, if there's a modernization of the family, of women, of, there's a sense that there's now rights which attach to women in the way that they didn't in the past, then that immediately kind of creates turmoil in your sense of an unbroken tradition, uh, because it's breaking in front of you, right? It's breaking right there in front of you. Now the question is, does that breakage produce trauma, or does it produce a kind of exhilaration and a feeling of liberation? Like recently we had these new laws, decriminalizing homosexuality, and there's now some debate around legitimizing gay marriage. Oh, okay. So it's so liberating for millions of people for whom their sexuality has always been, um, you know, excluded or denied, or seen as problematic, or worse than problematic. It's been seen as illegitimate. Um, so for them, it's great if the traditional marriage, the traditional family, the traditional kind of gendered roles that are assigned by society are jettisoned. For them, it's very affirming, and it allows them to go forth and be who they are. But for others, it can appear like Indian society is falling apart, right? And what's going to happen to the Indian joint family, or to marriage, which is such a source of stability in some sort of structural sense. And this can be extended to caste as well. I mean, caste endogamy is the worst thing, um, from a political perspective, or from the perspective of rights, and from the perspective of the autonomy and liberty of individuals, and the self-actualization, the opportunities for self-actualization of individuals. But caste endogamy also has produced a remarkably stable social order over thousands of years, over hundreds of generations, and there's something to be said for that. I mean, we may put a value on it as being good or bad, or right or wrong, but it has nevertheless resulted in the kind of society that for the most part we recognize as being Indian, right? So it's not something you can gainsay. Like, you can't just sort of wish it away. You can't just get up in the morning and say, oh, there's no such thing as caste and I can be who I want to be. Because you know what, there's not one thing you will be able to do actually when you set out to do it. If you want to have an interreligious marriage, you want to have an intercaste marriage, you want to raise a child, um, in ways that don't shackle the child with those inherited identities and those traditional ideas, that child is going to enter into a battlefield or into a minefield, or they're going to have to fight it out at every step, and you're going to have to make all kinds of choices which you are not prepared for in any sense. So it's tradition, or our idea of tradition, provides some kind of stability in the face of inexorable historical change, which is now very much accelerated with, the sort of geophysical state of our planet. Change is not now, we're graduating from, I don't know, cattle carts to cars. Change is now, the world may come to an end in like 200 years, right? So the acceleration in the change in social and human life and planetary life is so much that everywhere people are turning to what they know, and what has been apparently unchanging. A lot of that is essentially religious in character, or something like that, cultural mores that are basically unchanging. I've written at great length about tradition and modernity in my first book, Righteous Republic. And there I'm trying to look at knowledge traditions and traditions of political thought. And one of the things I look at, especially in the beginning, in the introduction, is, how do traditions continue to flourish, and why do knowledge traditions end? Because they do end, and newer ones take over. And if there is to be a renewal and a continuity, and if there is to be, successful adaptation to changing conditions, then one of the things that philosophers and theorists of tradition and modernity have suggested is that you need a breakthrough. You need a breakthrough, because one way of thinking about things, one way of looking at the world, one way of living ceases to be effective because conditions change, right? Now, either you can deal with that and get past it and move on. So you have what is called an epistemological breakthrough. You reorient your ways of knowing and ways of being in the world, or you don't, in which case that way of being and knowing dies. It dies and it ends, and it passes irrevocably into the past and irretrievably into the past.
In your answer to the previous question, you mentioned your book, Righteous Republic, and in the introduction, you talk a lot about India's self and Swaraj, and you also talk about India's longing for a sense of selfhood and things like that. So, I was sort of wondering, how do policies they build on the idea of the political, or say what is exactly the political, and especially say in the Indian context, because a lot of these sort of say policies in India's say reservation policy, or say even reservation of women in the parliament, started after 1947 when India became a nation.
Um, I think one way of asking the question is, when India came into being as an independent nation state, and when it was decolonized and partitioned and declared independent, did we achieve Swaraj? Okay. And is Swaraj when we say the political life of India in the post-colonial period, are we saying that that is Swaraj writ large? Is that the realization and the working out of the idea of Swaraj? Is that what it is, or is it something else? Right? That's one way of posing the question. And are various kinds of policies, let's say around representation, around rights, around affirmative action, around development, around growth, all kinds of policies, economic, social, political, etc. Are they deepening and expanding and developing Swaraj, or are they having some other effect? Right? I think I think there was some sense in which Gandhi already experienced a sense of failure, even at the time of independence, even when, in a sense, the nationalist project was realized at independence, or even when he didn't live to see the promulgation of the Constitution, but the Constituent Assembly had already kind of begun its deliberations, and they were midway through it when he was killed and so on. But there was a way, I think, he saw that Swaraj, in his sense, was not what we were going to get. Yeah. And partition already made that impossible. The communal fragmentation and division of the country made that obviated that dream. And subsequently, the inheriting the kind of unreflexive and uncritical adoption, you could say, of many forms of colonial governance and the continuity, in a sense, under new names of colonial practices and colonial state practices, especially, already meant that it was a very compromised sense of, a fresh start. It wasn't, you weren't starting with a clean slate by any means. And the idealism of much of what had been imagined or conceived was already always sort of diluted and already compromised and already, you'd given the game away in a sense. You'd compromised in such fundamental ways, especially because of communal situation at that time. But that critique of Swaraj, uh, that critique of the form in which Swaraj was translated as independence and partition, that came not only from its author, who was Gandhi, but also from Ambedkar, because Ambedkar even said, in his speeches to the Constituent Assembly that, look, this is like a partial victory, and this is a job half done, and you've effected some kind of a political revolution, but you haven't followed it up with a social revolution. And what he meant by revolution there was that the transformation from empire to nation is a political revolution, but caste society remains constant. And so you'd have not had the kind of social change that would really make it possible to make a fresh start. So independence is incomplete. Swaraj is not what we have, because we're still dragging those old burdens with us into the present. And indeed, 75 years later, I would say we're still dragging them. It's not just that we were dragging them, you know, at that moment of the beginning, so to speak. And in many ways, some of the worst excesses of the colonial state have been exacerbated over time. For example, national security laws and policies that have to do with development, especially in tribal areas. Attitudes towards agriculture and rural life, towards forest communities, towards basically non-urban populations, all these kind of things, policies around language, policies around education. So much is just being continued uncritically. And despite the fact that it's not working for generations, it hasn't worked. So I think the horizon of Swaraj is still ahead in some sense, and unfortunately what has happened is that we have lost any memory of that as a project. We've lost the commitment to that as a goal. We've lost any understanding of what that word meant and what it stood for and how it mobilized generations, over 50 to 100 years before the actual independence of India. What was Swaraj doing? What did it stand for? What did it symbolize? That was so powerful, that it galvanized all of this fervor, and this deep desire for change, and for freedom. And if that freedom has not been achieved, or that freedom has been poisoned in some sense, then how do we put it back on the table as a dream that's as yet unrealized? That quest for the self has to continue, and that quest for a genuine sovereignty has to continue. But it's not. Not only is it not continuing in the old form, but it's also not. It's not been reinvented in any meaningful way, And in fact, yeah, I mean, there's been so much distortion and so much loss and so much, um, you know, losing of the way. I think, especially in this century or in the last 20, 30 years. Sometimes you just despair for the future of this country. It has everything going for it, and yet it has also everything going wrong. That's what I think. And if we could remember a little bit, or be willing to learn from what the sort of founding generations, what they had spent decades thinking about and writing about and agitating about, if we could even revisit that, it would already be a good start for us, I think, or a fresh start for us.
So we talked about how like Gandhi and Ambedkar had different aspirations and they sort of thought of the self in different ways. And so how would you think that their intellectual legacies have permeated into our thinking as 21st century Indians as well? Or have they even permeated our thinking, or have they been brushed aside as history and not and deemed irrelevant to present day India?
See, I think there's a crisis in terms of intellectual leadership today. And in fact, I was just reading an article by Harish Wankede. He's a colleague, a younger scholar actually at JNU. Uh, it was Ambedkar Jayanti, a few days ago on April 14th, and he had an article in the Wire, I think, about Ambedkar as an intellectual and how the intellectual nature of Ambedkar's leadership was important for the Dalit movement. It wasn't just important for the country as a whole, because of course Ambedkar was using his education and his training in the law and sociology and in the classics, and his erudition and his legal and juridical mind. He was putting all that, of course, into making the constitution, for example, or writing early policies for justice, social justice of various kinds. So that was there, but for the Dalit movement and for the anti-caste kind of politics of the time, he argued that the fact that Ambedkar was so educated, and the fact that he was so learned, the fact that he was an intellectual, and that he could be an intellectual in exactly, or perhaps an even great country, which is not just for the Dalit movement. I mean, it's for everybody, and you can see that manifested first of all in the hollowing out of our education system, the attack on our universities by the kind of dispensation that we have. Also, the internal contradictions of an educational system that has not sorted out its basics. Whether in terms of reservations or in terms of languages or in terms of like skills and vocational training versus other kinds of more knowledge for knowledge's sake kind of educational opportunities. So the system is collapsing in on itself. It's also being attacked in an urge to remake it into something which right now doesn't look very good, but I mean, we still don't know really where it's going. So in that sense, there's a crisis, but also in the sense of, you know, you don't really see the best minds anymore in the highest echelons of like economic planning, for example, or really vital areas, thinking about environmental policy, thinking about economic policy, thinking about educational policy, um, thinking about history and the past, you know, making syllabi, making sure that at every level, we are educating our citizens, educating citizens about their rights as citizens. There's a crisis in all of these fields, and that is because we are, we're fundamentally in the grip of a massive intellectual crisis, and this is true all over the world, by the way, where you have right-wing and populist regimes. One of the first kind of casualties is intellectual life in this kind of a political authoritarian and illiberal political environment. And the whole kind of, these are all related values, and so you knock one thing over and everything goes. There's truth, there's facts, there's you know a commitment to justice, there's a commitment to freedom, and all of that is related, and it's all falling down, like a house of cards. So again, I mean, it seems to me to be a very alarming sort of situation that we are in. And when you look back at Ambedkar and Gandhi and others like them, Tagore, I've written at length about Tagore. I mean, these people were founding universities. And that was their way of doing politics. And founding universities, founding ashrams, founding colleges, founding libraries. I mean, I visited, for example, Milan College in Aurangabad, which Ambedkar gave most of his books there. Siddharth College in Bombay. I've been to Shanti Niketan many times. I like going there. You go to Sabarmati, you go to Wardha. I mean, it's a continuum of truth and knowledge and politics, and these people see themselves as not just but being a politician also means that you are in the business, like I said, of a kind of public pedagogy. That's how they saw themselves as leaders, कि लोगों को रास्ता दिखाना है, पढ़ाना है, उनको सिखाना है, पढ़ाना नहीं है necessarily, but सिखाना है, कि this is the way ahead, this is the way out of where we are, this is how to solve a problem. We are all engaged in a common endeavor, which is the political endeavor or the endeavor to achieve Swaraj or whatever it is, and we have to learn how to live together. We have to learn how to address the problems that we face. And how are you going to learn if there's nobody to teach you? So some people have to play that role in society, and that's what I think is a major difference between what we had at the time of the creation of this country and what we have today at the time of the destruction of this country. That's my feeling.
I think that sort of brings me back to my last question, because you say similar points in your other article, The Thinking Indian, which was published way back in 2005 for the Indian Express. You also quote V.S. Naipaul there, who made a similar statement that India is facing a dearth of intellectual leaders, especially in the political sphere right now. But I think as, say, a person who was born in the 21st century,
Gosh. Okay, all right.
Who's not even 20 yet.
Yeah.
I think my question would be, who is that thinking Indian then? Who is that post-colonial thinking Indian? Because right now we have a dearth of intellectual leaders. Who do we look to then? Do we say go back to Gandhi and Ambedkar and say try to again bring them back now, or should we become those thinking Indians in the post?
Well, I certainly hope that you are going to become a thinking Indian. Um, uh, well, yes. I mean, there's always, as one of the former professor here at Ashoka, um, Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta, he always, there's something he always says to friends, but also to his students. I mean, you have to continue to your dialogue with the ancients, and for him that means going back and reading his Plato and his Socrates and other kind of uh, sort of classics of political theory and of the origins of democracy and so on. But the dialogue with the ancients, I think what he means by that, I mean, he told me this when I was writing my book or when I was much younger, just entering into, thinking about these things is, I would include, talking to Gandhi or talking to Ambedkar in that. I mean, they're not ancient in the sense that they didn't exist thousands of years ago, but there's a sense of perennial questions, again, to use one of Pratap's phrases as God, soul, and eternity. But I mean, that can come off sounding like you're only interested in questions which are metaphysical or which are religious in nature. But no, what we mean by that is that there are transcending questions about human existence and conditio humana, the human condition, um, uh, and there is the fact of our mortality, which from the Buddha onwards, I mean, has been a matter of concern to all thinking people. And there are forms of traditional and organic wisdom, which you don't have to be particularly educated in the sense of being book learned to necessarily have, but we see that in everyday life around us and in ordinary people that we interact with. They know how to live. They know how to be good, kind, um, you know, upstanding humans. They know how to be good parents and good citizens without necessarily having that kind of book learning. But to recognize what those values are and to know that we need them in order to live decent lives as human beings and live in a situation where we are not isolated, where we are connected to and immersed in a social fabric, that is what young people should worry about. I think there's two things to worry about. One is, of course, the future of the planet in a very kind of physical sense. But the other is the ability to maintain a decent society. Because what is in extreme stress right now in this country and in most countries is our protocols for coexistence, for mutual respect, and for creating the kind of space for exchange and dialogue and mutual understanding that allows everyone to live, and doesn't put some sections of the population continuously on the back foot or continuously in a state of deprivation, or in danger. So that we are losing, and that should be the primary concern for young people like you who have, the rest of your lives ahead of you. I mean, we've lived most of our lives. In the worst case, on very bad days, you think, well, it's not much longer, thank God. But but it's not the case for those who are young. And so yes, you can learn from every good example you see around you.
We are very grateful to Professor Ananya Vajpeyi, who accepted our invitation and took the time out to talk to us. If you like this episode, then please do like, share, and subscribe to Quintessential Conversations, and stay tuned for more.